Earlier, I spoke with Indonesia's Finance Minister Sri Mulyani Indrawati. I began by asking her about her stimulus plans.
We are not really actually assuming that the COVID is going to only last 6 months. The design of our fiscal as well as all the policy response is actually expecting, or at least we know that there is COVID and how it will end is so uncertain. And that's why the way we respond to this, first, for 2020, we really focus on how we are going to use on our fiscal side, the budget stimulus and changing the way we govern and design our budget to respond to this COVID-19. Whether this is on a health, whether this is on a social safety net, or on protecting the small, medium business, and how we are going to stimulate again the economy, especially on the second half. The way we designed this for 2020 is actually to cover until December. Now we are still discussing at the early stage with the parliament for 2021 budget. So it's not really like the Indonesia only preparing for 6 months. For example, for the health, this is going to continue for until December, and we are designing how we should continue design the health spending for 2021. For social safety net, most of the social safety net has been extended until December, and now we're discussing with the parliament how we are going to design for the next year, 2021 budget design for the social safety net. We are doing also a reform on that area. And then for the support for the business, especially small and medium enterprises, it is designed for 6 months. But until now, we are still actually discussing with the banking system how we are going to implement. Some of it is already in place and need for the bank to do the restructuring, and we are going to support those restructuring. So basically, this is really a very dynamic, and we are not really, in this case, is only preparing for 6 months.
If you do need additional stimulus, how will you find the resources to fund it?
Yeah, well, the resources, the budget is definitely affected in many ways. First, our revenue will be contracted by our estimation now 10%, both in terms of tax and non-tax revenue. As you can imagine, many businesses now closed, or they are at least quasi-closed, almost closed. And that's why their volume of activity declined. We are expecting the second quarter of this year, the GDP will be contracted by minus 3.8%. So this is going to definitely affect our revenue. But in addition to that, we also launching a lot of incentive. And that is actually creating and providing incentive in terms of relaxation or cutting the corporate income tax. This is creating also additional pressure on the revenue. But it's okay because the economy is still in a very, very big pressure from this COVID. And then we also have the spending side, which is increased quite substantially from the health as well as for protecting the people, so social safety net. The deficit is widened from originally the budget is 1.76% of GDP into 6.34% of GDP. How we are going to finance that? First, we are going to get the support from first using our own resources. As you can imagine that last year or through many years before, we accumulated what we call it unspent revenue. Or financing, and this is going to be our last resort to actually spend during this situation. We also use many of the sovereign fund, which is allocated, for example, for education. They actually are managing quite substantial money who can then buy government bonds. We also increase support from multilateral and bilateral support. Basically, World Bank, ADB, even AIIB, Islamic Development Bank, they are all want to support Indonesia by increasing, especially on this pandemic response policy. And then we issue bonds, of course, from global and local. On a global, we've already upsized, and from local, we are discussing with Bank Indonesia because they are not allowed by our law to buy the bonds on the primary market.
Right. You talked about Bank Indonesia. Members of the Budget Committee increasingly asking for Bank Indonesia to shoulder more of the stimulus costs, even buy bonds from the government at zero coupon rate. How feasible is that?
Well, Indonesia may be different from many other countries, for example, like Federal Reserve or many central bank in ASEAN, that their mandate on the central bank is actually wide. In this case, not only just inflation or exchange rate. Bank Indonesia, since ASEAN financial crisis, Indonesia banking crisis 97-98, has been created to become or recreated to become an independent central bank with a very focus only for inflation or stabilization of the rupiah. So this is really a constraint for Bank Indonesia to actually allow themselves to also shouldering the burden. If you look at many other central bank like Federal Reserve or Bank of Thailand, they are actually doing their part by involving directly to the economic activity. For example, like in Thailand, the central bank said that they do even bond stabilization fund for the corporation. So they actually can lend directly to the private sector, not through the banking system. This is not the case for Indonesia. So what we are doing now, while at the same time, everybody recognize that COVID definitely affecting economy severely. And that's why for us, for Indonesia, we have one possibility which is provided by our emergency law that allowing Bank Indonesia now to finance the government deficit, especially for the COVID related, through primary market. And now the discussion is, of course, we have an agreement with Bank Indonesia to allow this to still continue using the market mechanism. But we also see that the market sometimes is very volatile. So we're discussing with Bank Indonesia how we are going to share the burden in a still credible way that allowing market to still continue function, but at the same time allowing government of Indonesia, in this case our budget, to have a certain burden to be shared by the Bank Indonesia. So this is what we are still discussing with Bank Indonesia. We are not using what we call it, or we are not yet decided about what kind of instrument that we are going to use. So for example, the word zero coupon bond is not really exactly like that. I'm still discussing with central bank about what kind of instrument which allowing Bank Indonesia to share burden. But in the medium long term, we still continue have to maintain the credibility of fiscal monetary authority in managing the macroeconomic discipline in Indonesia. So this is really a very fine balance that we, Bank Indonesia and myself, Pak Perry and myself, really try to establish how we are going to manage this very shocking effect from the COVID. But at the same time, we don't want to destroy what is actually the good achievement of Indonesia of managing and maintaining a good prudent macro policy. So this is the situation that we are having.
In a country like Indonesia, Minister, where monetary policy transmission is pretty slow, how significant are central bank policies in supporting growth?
Well, this is exactly the challenge that we are discussing. Because even Bank Indonesia is already do their part, for example, reducing the reserve requirement, they also reducing the interest rate, but the transmission of the monetary policy into the real sector activity that is stimulating the economy is quite limited. There are a couple of challenges that Indonesia is still facing. For example, like we are actually looking at the situation whether the intermediary function is it constrained by the structure or the shallowness of the financial sector in Indonesia. We also look at why the banking sector is not transmitting this to the real sector. So if it is in the US term, Wall Street to the Main Street. This is how we are actually now discussing how and what instrument we should do. So for example, that this may require government involvement, whether this is related to the risk. For example, banking sector doesn't want to lend, especially during situation, and their interest rate is stubbornly still widened in terms of their gap between the policy rate of Bank Indonesia and the real rate in main street in this case. So this is the one that we are discussing with Bank Indonesia as well as the banking system or OJK. The pass-through effect of the reducing interest rate and reserve requirement is actually tried to stimulate economy from the monetary side and banking side. While the government of Indonesia, from our fiscal side, we also stimulus the economy through our spending. Now we are trying to combine the instrument so that the effect to the real economy can be actually felt more effectively.
Minister, just last week, you candidly said that if there is a second virus wave, you can only pray, your own words. What kind of contraction could we possibly see in the Indonesian economy if that were to happen?
Well, I have to put it in a context. First, as a minister, and we are still, as I said earlier, that we are not only focusing on 2020 budget, we just still continue very dynamic, and that's why we actually proposing to the parliament the changes of the budget even already twice now. This is because we always continue adjusting how we are going to respond to the development of this COVID-related situation, whether on a social economy or even in the banking system. The second one is also because the nature of uncertainty itself. At the same time, I have to prepare the 2021 budget, which the president is going to submit to the parliament next August. So you can imagine that you are preparing something for 2021 while you actually still cannot control and really don't know how this is going to evolve. Because I think no country in the world can claim that I'm now safe, nothing will happen. It's not going to be that way, right? So what we are going to do is actually try to prepare of this kind of scenario. If there will be no second wave, that means the recovery on the economy for the fourth quarter or beginning very early on the third quarter of this year will accelerate it to 2021. So then that we are going to do in order for us to be able to accelerate this recovery of the economy. This is really, I mean, you are making a policy that is the commitment will last for the next 12 months for next year, while we are still in a very uncertain time. I think if I said that we have to pray, I think this is the most the humble thing that any human being can do during this kind of situation. So basically, we will try to do our best, and we always continue praying that this is going to last in not so long time.
Minister, what are your views on the rupiah? It has stabilized, is up about 15% year to date. It's recovered almost all its losses from the March turmoil. But Governor Periwarjio says the rupiah is still undervalued. Do you share the view? Is there a fair value for the currency?
Well, first, the rupiah is always affected by the fundamental, which for Indonesia, before COVID, we are actually addressing the issue of the fundamental that support our fair value of rupiah, whether this is on a trade balance or on a current account balance. And that's why what is the government doing? Try to boost export by increasing productivity and competitiveness. We also reforming our economic policy, so it will attract more capital so that the current account is going to be positive. We also boosting, for example, our tourism. This is also one of the potential to generate the foreign reserve. So these are all things that we are doing in order to address the issue of the Indonesia fundamental to support our rupiah. On the other hand, we also know that the rupiah is also affected by sentiment, or is even in this case, the dynamic in Wall Street or in Europe is going to also affect our rupiah. And this is the situation in which we are facing today. No one can actually describe it well, but saying that all the dynamic is actually starting to increase with the geopolitical, what is happening between US and China and Europe, and that's create a sentiment. So the COVID adding to all those dynamics. And we see that, for example, during March and April, when this panic on the financial sector is really affecting all the emerging country currencies. So for Indonesia, I think what is happening today in May and June, when relatively the sentiment, at least digesting this COVID situation relatively now well. At least they recalibrate their assessment of the risk. Then we see that rupiah settle in an equilibrium, which is less affected by this panic and herd behavior, and is more supported by the fundamental. And then in the future, I think what Bank Indonesia is continue doing is actually, on the one hand, we will look at all this competitiveness, that is the fundamental to support rupiah, that is our productivity, competitiveness, and policy on investment, boosting export, as well as all that is a foreign reserve generating activity. On the other hand, we also improve our flexibility on the rupiah as shown by Bank Indonesia. So with that, I think we will look at the flexibility of the exchange rate as one of the shock absorber when the situation is really very dynamic.
But I guess the question is whether a further appreciation in the rupiah would affect the overall economy. Would it be beneficial for the overall Indonesian economy if the rupiah was stronger?
Well, we certainly knows that any currency, if it is too strongly appreciated, will basically affecting the competitiveness of those economy. But on the other hand, if it is too depreciated, it's also affecting the sentiment against those economy, whether they are perceived as weak or in this case vulnerable, or also in this case, in our case, on many other country cases, is actually also can affect our imported inflation. So basically what I'm saying is that we are not aiming for a certain level, but we are aiming for stability with some flexibility, which, as I said, exchange rates become one of the shock absorber. So in this case, I think Bank Indonesia and ourselves is going to focus on how we are going to improve the fundamental of our economy. On the other hand, we also want to make sure that the level of rupiah will reflect those fine balance between the perception as well as the fundamental of the economy is actually there, as well as the competitiveness of the economy, especially those related to the open market, that is the global economy, is going to be preserved. That is the competitiveness which is not going to be what you call it affected negatively by a level of rupiah which is distorted. So it's really a fine balance on those two.
Minister, you are Managing Director and Chief Operating Officer of the World Bank. I'd love to get your views on the challenges ahead for the global economy as they pull back the stimulus. It's still too early for central banks and governments to be pulling back, but they have to make arrangements for that. How do governments begin to rein in that debt? And at the end of it, when the music stops, how much of mopping up do governments and central banks have to do?
Well, this is really, I mean, we are still in the middle of this COVID, and no one knows how this is going to end. Of course, everybody will get all the best effort to get the vaccine. But during this particular extraordinary time, the government have to use all the instruments to actually help the economy and the people. And that's exactly what our country is doing. Of course, the effectiveness of this, how the government design policies depend on each country. For example, how you are going to spend on the health sector, how you are going to spend on the social safety net, how prepared or how good the data, how robust the mechanism, how effective this response, how you are going to support the small, medium enterprises, how you are going to make sure that the banking system is going to continue stable and robust. These are all the challenges that are facing by all countries in the world, which is now facing the COVID threat as well as the economic downturn threat. And the fiscal expansion as well as even monetary expansion is unavoidable. The question is not why you're doing it now. I think it's so obvious the reason why. But the question which is how you are going to make sure this is not going to continue to become a habit of non-disciplinary fiscal and monetary policy. And in this case, each country have their own. My own for Indonesia, we are lucky enough because in the past 20 years with the fiscal discipline rule and the independence of the central bank, we have the institutional arrangement that allowing this discipline to be adopted. And even in this case, by the parliament or supreme audit, they are always actually creating a check and balance to us. So I'm sure in this case for all country, after this year big spending, you have to continue thinking now how you consolidate your fiscal. This is exactly what we are doing in Indonesia. Next year, we definitely aiming for deficit lower, and we are going to like make sure that we are going to have a fiscal discipline path in the medium long term.
I guess a follow-up question to that is that we've seen how stable the bond markets have been. Would it be tempting for governments to carry on spending?
Well, this is exactly, I mean, the bondholder will really see whether they make a judgment, whether this kind of spending justified or not. If this is just reflecting a reckless spending, or just the government just want to have an easy spending by issuing more and more bond, I think they don't have the trust and confidence on the bonds. But if they see that the government really calculating well and very carefully why we are spending this much,